The United States is amid a health emergency. Nearly 90% of healthcare spending goes to treating people who have chronic diseases. More than 70% of American adults are overweight or obese. Diet-driven chronic disease now disqualifies large numbers of young Americans from military service, undermining national readiness and cutting off a historic pathway to opportunity and upward mobility. Okay, we'll have to wait and see. One thing that's clear, though, is the tone of the guidelines are completely different. So I think this is going to bother a lot of people. Prior to this, the guidelines are generally pretty neutral, very academic-oriented, consensus-driven. This one is very much not that. This one is directive. It conveys the idea that meat and dairy are equal to vegetables, which is not evidence-based. It's just not. This conveys the message that butter is sort of equivalent to avocado and olive oil, which again is just not evidence-based. But having said that, I think anybody who's being honest and looks at all of the data is going to have a really hard time with the idea that salmon is equivalent to turkey is equivalent to steak or hamburger in terms of health benefits or health risks. Like, that just is not supported by the data that we have today. I think in general, it's not really as big a shift as it's presented as. So there's a lot of rhetoric. So my final grade, after really going through everything, is I'm going to give the guidelines a solid B. As I said, I started at an A-, B+. Now I've landed solid B. It's pretty good. Hey everyone, welcome to the Optispan podcast. On today's episode, we're going to take a look at the new Dietary Guidelines for Americans. You may have heard these dropped last week. They've gotten quite a bit of attention. I've been interviewed for a few different outlets about the guidelines. Dr. Byrne and I put out our initial reactions on social media. I think if you'd asked me last week when I first saw the guidelines and the new pyramid, I would have said A-, B+. I've now read every word of the guidelines, and I kind of land on a solid B. So what I wanted to do today is help you understand what this is all about, what's new, what's not, what's good, what's maybe not so good, and separate a little bit of the political theater from the science. So first thing I want to say related to that is I really would like to leave politics at the door. One of the reporters who was interviewing me, I think, was really trying hard to get me to bash RFK Jr. I know people have very strong opinions on both sides. In my opinion, health policy and science should really not be political issues. I think, unfortunately, we live in a reality where it's sometimes hard to separate those things, but I'm going to do my best to leave all the political nonsense out of this and the personalities, other than to note a couple of places perhaps where I think politics were intentionally injected into the guidelines. And in many ways, I think that's counterproductive. But overall, I really want to focus on what's the content here and leave the politics out of it. So my final grade, after really going through everything, is I'm going to give the guidelines a solid B. As I said, I started at an A-, B+. Now I've landed solid B. It's pretty good. I think there's a lot of stuff in here to be pleased with. There are some problems and places where it doesn't completely match up with the science, and that's really what keeps me from giving it an A. Okay. So let's start with what probably most people see first, and that's the new pyramid. So one thing you'll probably notice right away is they flipped it upside down, right? So the base of the pyramid is now at the top, and the pointy part is now at the bottom. So that took me a second to wrap my head around. But other than that, what really is new here? So I think the biggest thing, and it's a good thing, is the emphasis on whole foods. They say directly in the report, eat real foods. I think that's a really good take-home message. It's one of the biggest strengths of the guidelines. And honestly, it's probably the most impactful single thing that most Americans could do to improve their diet and improve their health. So I really like that. That's really what this pyramid is focused around, is eating whole foods, avoiding ultra-processed foods and added sugars. I think one of the weaknesses of the pyramid, as it's drawn here in the graphic, is it conveys the idea that meat and dairy are equal to vegetables, which is not evidence-based. It's just not. So I think that's kind of unfortunate. They sort of broke this into three areas. There's protein, dairy, and healthy fats. And one section, there's vegetables and fruits in another section, and then down at the bottom in the thinnest section is whole grains. Unfortunately, the way this is organized is it conveys, you've got a big fat steak up there at exactly the same level as you've got broccoli. So that doesn't make sense. And it's unfortunate. I don't know that the guidelines themselves say that. In fact, they don't, but the graphic certainly conveys that. And then even more, I think, problematic from just a visual presentation perspective is right in the area with the healthy fats, you've got a slab of butter. So again, not that butter's necessarily something you shouldn't eat. In fact, I think there are times where it's appropriate. This conveys the message that butter is sort of equivalent to avocado and olive oil, which again is just not evidence-based. So I think the way the graphic is laid out, and this was clearly intentional, sort of misrepresents the best evidence that we've got today. And I know there's a lot of nuance around that, but I don't think anybody who really understands the data and is being unbiased would suggest that when you take everything that we know or we think we know from epidemiology and nutritional science, that you're going to put butter and steak at the same level that you're going to put broccoli and avocados in terms of the likelihood of something being beneficial for your health. So anyways, that's my one criticism of the graphic. But the emphasis on whole foods, fantastic. I think dead on. Okay. Is it an improvement over MyPlate, which was the last iteration of this? So some of you may recall that the last round of the dietary guidelines more or less got rid of the food pyramid and went to this MyPlate graphic, which was, fruits, vegetables, grains, protein, sort of you want it to be roughly equal portions on your plate, and then dairy on the side. Yeah, I think this is a better representation than MyPlate. I think, again, the emphasis on whole foods, super, super important. I like the inverted pyramid better than MyPlate. How does it compare to the 1992 pyramid? Again, I think it's an improvement, and it should be. Don't get me wrong. We've learned a lot since 1992. So in 1992, the base of the pyramid was bread, cereal, rice, and pasta group. I think we now know that's backwards. Having vegetables as the base of the pyramid makes a lot more sense. Whole foods certainly makes a lot more sense. So I think this is a step in the right direction compared to where we were 30 or so years ago with the food pyramid. So how does this compare to the most recent dietary guidelines? And so these things go in 5-year cycles. So this is the 2026 to 2030 cycle. How does this compare to the prior cycle ending in 2025? The biggest shift really is a shift away from dietary patterns towards real food. And so in many ways, I view these dietary guidelines as really, it's a conceptual change as much or more than it is a change in the real, nuts and bolts of the recommendations. Rhetorical, certainly, shift away from what I would call nutrient reductionism to food quality. So instead of thinking of it in terms of amounts of good fat, bad fat, sugar, protein, salt, the new message is really avoid processed foods, eat whole foods. I think that's a good message. I think it's simple and clear enough that people will get it. Will it change behavior without incentive and policy changes? I think that's a larger discussion, and we'll have to wait and see. One thing that's clear, though, is the tone of the guidelines are completely different. So I think this is going to bother a lot of people. Prior to this, the guidelines are generally pretty neutral, very academic oriented, consensus driven. This one is very much not that. This one is directive. It calls prior efforts a quote unquote failure, explicitly talks about MAHA in the cover page, talks about the Trump administration, frames this as a reset. I think that language is really a mixed bag. And in some ways it's inaccurate, but maybe it's a good marketing technique. Again, I think we'll have to wait and see. Time will tell. I think the policy implementation was a failure. I think if you look at what the guidelines said, in general, they were pretty solidly based on what was known at the time. Really, it wasn't the guidelines, it was how they were implemented in terms of policy in society. So I think, again, it remains to be seen whether the current or future administrations will do a better job at policy implementation. I think the communications around simplifying the message here, though, is a good thing. So prior to this, the guidelines were way too long and complicated for the typical person to digest. So the audience was not the average American, right? It was academics, clinicians, nutritionists. The prior guidelines were 160 plus pages. These are 10. So absolutely would encourage you to read the entire thing. Doesn't take that long. At the end of this episode, if you want to stick around, I will do a dramatic reading of the guidelines with my own sort of thoughts interspersed. So not really sure how many people will actually read it, but the take-home messages are pretty clear and pretty accurate. One thing that is missing from these guidelines, and maybe they'll release them in an appendix or in some future day, are nutritional templates to guide implementation. So for clinicians, nutritionists that are looking for real templated dietary guidelines, you're not going to find that here. Okay, so what are the take-home messages of the 2026 Dietary Guidelines for Americans? Pretty straightforward. Eat whole foods, minimize processed foods, minimize added sugars, get adequate protein, drink less alcohol. Boom, you nailed it. Like, that's great. That is freaking fantastic advice. So I think at that level, this is really good. Really simple, really straightforward. People can get it, and it's the right advice to be giving people around nutrition from a very broad perspective. We'll come back to the alcohol piece in a minute because there's a little bit of controversy about this. But in general, the idea that drinking less alcohol is better for your health is good advice. Okay, where do the messages here diverge a little bit from the science? I think one area is they really emphasize full-fat dairy, certainly emphasize it more than the current data, in my view, would support. I think we've learned that a lot of the negative talk around full-fat dairy was overstated, at least. But it's not really clear that full-fat dairy is, first of all, good for you, or secondly, better than low-fat dairy or non-fat dairy. So I think the way the guidelines are framed overstates the evidence that everybody should be drinking or eating full-fat dairy foods. Okay. Likewise, I think the emphasis on meat protein is overstated here. And it is certainly implied that, first of all, meat is a necessary and important aspect of a healthy diet, that it's roughly equivalent to vegetables in health qualities, where I think maybe a more nuanced and accurate view of meat, particularly when it comes to protein, is that it's harder to get adequate protein if you're not including meat in your diet, but it's not impossible. I think you can have a healthy vegetarian diet, and you just have to work a little bit harder to get adequate protein and some of the nutrients that are available in meat with vegetarian and vegan diets. But the way the guidelines are written, it sort of implies meat is part of a healthy diet, full stop. Okay. And then related to meat, I think in a little bit even more depth, is this sort of implied message that there's an equivalency between red meat, poultry, and seafood in terms of the evidence for health benefits. Again, lots of nuance here. I think in some ways, the concerns around red meat have been overblown, in part because a lot of the studies suggesting negative effects from red meat have been confounded by the fact that sometimes those are unhealthy processed forms of red meat that people are eating. And most of those people eating a lot of red meat are also eating a low quality diet in general. But having said that, I think anybody who's being honest and looks at all of the data is going to have a really hard time with the idea that salmon is equivalent to turkey, is equivalent to steak or hamburger in terms of health benefits or health risks. Like, that just is not supported by the data that we have today. So I thought, again, this was where the guidelines, at least in the way it's presented, diverge a bit from current best evidence that we've got. I think they could have done a better job if they had just prioritized quality seafood, then poultry, then quality red meat in moderation, and tell people to avoid processed meats. That would be more in line with what the current evidence supports. Okay, I think one other area, and this is relatively minor, but it was interesting to me. They also sort of made an equivalency between added sugars, so hidden sugars in food that don't need to be there, with food additives and food dyes and artificial sweeteners. And again, in my mind, there is no equivalency. Added sugars are way worse in terms of sort of overall health implications for the general population and healthcare costs. Added sugars are way worse than food dyes. It's good to get the food dyes out of the food, but that's incremental compared to what could be accomplished if we got the added sugars out of the food. So added sugars, way worse than food dyes way worse than artificial sweeteners. And that may not be completely supportable, but that's my intuition. I don't think artificial sweeteners at moderate levels are really much of a problem at all. So again, this is where they could have done a much better job if instead of making it seem like all of these things are equivalent in importance, helping people understand where you're going to get the biggest bang for the buck. So if you want to have a Diet Coke every once in a while, have a Diet Coke. I don't think there's a problem with that. All right. And then the last thing I would just point to is this suggestion that whole grains are necessary for a healthy diet. I don't have any problem with whole grains. I think it's certainly better than refined, processed grains. But I also think there's not really any good evidence that you have to eat whole grains to eat a healthy diet. And again, it's sort of implied here. Everybody should be getting 2 to 4 servings of whole grains a day. I just don't think I don't think there's any reason that needs to be in there, other than I can see the sort of policy implications and at a population level, why they might want people to eat whole grains. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about here is to come back to alcohol, because I know there's been a lot of conversation around the new guidelines and how they differ from the old guidelines. So the prior guidelines gave very specific recommendations around alcohol. Those recommendations were no more than 1 drink per day for women, 2 drinks per day for men is consistent with a healthy diet and lifestyle. The current recommendations don't give specific numbers. They just say consume less alcohol for better health. So the question is, might this confuse people? I think first of all, we can have a legitimate conversation around whether the specific recommendations, 1 drink per day for women, 2 drinks per day for men, are the right recommendations. I think reasonable people, informed people can land on either side of that conversation. But I think what the criticism here is really whether there should be numbers given at all in the guidelines. One viewpoint is that without numbers, people might think that they can drink as much as they want. I don't think there's anything here that's like selective interpretation, right? The guidelines are very clear. Consume less alcohol for better health. What does less alcohol mean? It means less than what you're drinking now. So is that a license to drink for some people? Maybe. I think the other way, and this is sort of where I gravitate towards, to think about this is when you give people a target, 1 drink per day, 2 drinks per day, some people are going to view that as a license to drink that much. And I don't think there's any great evidence to suggest that 2 alcoholic drinks a day is optimal health lifestyle for the average person. So I don't really think this is a huge issue. I think the advice to drink less is good. Again, I think this really comes down to policy and incentives more than what's in the guidelines if we're really interested in changing people's behaviors around alcohol. And I'm not a teetotaler. I drink in moderation every once in a while. I think that can be consistent with a healthy lifestyle. And I'm not sure we need to give specific recommendations in the dietary guidelines. But I think this is not as much of an issue as it's being made out to be. So overall, grade is a B. Lots of good things in here, some less scientific things. I don't think this is as big a shift as it's being presented. There's a lot of rhetoric, but when it comes to the substance of the guidelines, I think it's really more conceptual and messaging than it is actual content. I absolutely love the overarching simple message of eat real food. I think that's great. If that alone causes people to eat less processed food and avoid added sugars, this is a big win. I think it's going to be much more likely to have that impact if it's followed up with policy changes that disincentivize companies and consumers away from processed foods and added sugars. So talk is cheap. They've done that part. Actions speak. Let's see what happens. So now I'm going to read the guidelines word for word. I will interject my comments here and there. So for any of you who don't want to take the time to read the guidelines, you can just continue with your earbuds in or on your commute to work, and you're going to get a dramatic reading of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans 2025 to 2030. You can see, if you're watching the video, I have marked this up quite a bit. So I have several comments. I don't want you to think that my grade of a B was just arbitrary and capricious. I really thought this through. All right. So we'll start with the cover page. So the cover page, again, this is where the rhetoric is a little bit, in my view, unnecessary. And then we'll get into the actual guidelines. So we'll start with the cover page. Message from the secretaries. Welcome to the Dietary Guidelines for Americans 2025 to 2030. These guidelines mark the most significant reset of federal nutrition policy in our nation's history. The message is simple. Eat real food. And I put 3 exclamation marks after that. Those are my annotations. To make America healthy again, we must return to the basics. American households must prioritize diets built on whole, nutrient-dense foods, protein, dairy, vegetables, fruits, healthy fats, and whole grains. Paired with a dramatic reduction in highly processed foods laden with refined carbohydrates, added sugars, excess sodium, unhealthy fats, and chemical additives, this approach can change the health trajectory for so many Americans. So I think that's great. Every time I hear "Make America Healthy Again," I can't help but think to myself, when exactly was America healthy? But I'm all for making America healthier. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's fine to have whole grains in there compared to refined. Sure, they're not needed in a healthy diet, in my view. Okay, going on. The United States is amid a health emergency. Nearly 90% of healthcare spending goes to treating people who have chronic diseases. You may have heard that on the podcast before. Many of these illnesses are not genetic destiny. They are a predictable result of the standard American diet. A diet which, over time, has become reliant on highly processed foods and coupled with a sedentary lifestyle. Absolutely true. The consequences have been devastating. More than 70% of American adults are overweight or obese. Nearly 1 in 3 American adolescents between the age of 12 and 17 has pre-diabetes. That's tragic. Diet-driven chronic disease now disqualifies large numbers of young Americans from military service, undermining national readiness and cutting off a historic pathway to opportunity and upward mobility. For decades, federal incentives have promoted low-quality, highly processed foods and pharmaceutical intervention instead of prevention. So I thought this was really good that they called out the federal incentives. Again, now let's see if they do anything about it. This crisis is the result of poor policy choices. Again, great that they called it out. Inadequate nutrition research, and lack of coordination across federal, state, local, and private partners. The inadequate nutrition research part is, again, something that this administration could do something about. It would be great to see more funding for adequate nutrition research. Okay, this changes today. We are realigning our food system to support American farmers, ranchers, and companies who grow and produce real food, and the Trump administration is working to ensure all families can afford it. So again, my personal opinion would be better to leave the politics out of this, but I get why they're doing it. We are putting real food back at the center of the American diet. Real food that nourishes the body. Real food that restores health. Real food that fuels energy and encourages movement and exercise. Real food that builds strength. Under President Trump's leadership, we are restoring common sense, scientific integrity, and accountability to federal food and health policy. And we are reclaiming the food pyramid and returning it to its true purpose of educating and nourishing all Americans. These guidelines call on every American to eat more real food. They call on farmers, ranchers, healthcare professionals, insurers, educators, community leaders, industry, and lawmakers across all levels of government to join in this critical effort. Together, we can shift our food system away from chronic disease and toward nutrient density, nourishment, resilience, and long-term health. America's future depends on what we grow, what we serve, and what we choose to eat. This is the foundation that will make America healthy again. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Secretary, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Brooke L. Rollins, Secretary, U.S. Department of Agriculture. Okay, so that's the cover page. Now we'll get into the actual guidelines, which don't have quite so much of the rhetoric that the cover page did. Okay, we'll start with, this is page 2. Eat the right amount for you. And so under each of these sections, there are a series of bullet points. So that's the section header. Eat the right amount for you. Bullet point number 1, the calories you need depend on your age, sex, height, weight, and level of physical activity. So it's good to point out individual differences in needs for caloric consumption. Bullet point number 2, pay attention to portion sizes, particularly for foods and beverages higher in calories. Also good advice. As you'll see, this is a theme throughout. Good advice, pretty vague on specifics, but when you're making population level guidelines, I suppose there's some value in being vague. This seems a little too vague for me, but at least the message is directionally correct. Bullet point number 3, hydration is a key factor in overall health. Choose water, still or sparkling, and unsweetened beverages. Okay. So then section number 2, prioritize protein foods at every meal. So this is a little bit of a new development. They are specifically calling out adequate protein as a critical component of a healthy diet. Bullet point number 1, prioritize high-quality, nutrient-dense protein foods as part of a healthy dietary pattern. Bullet point number 2, consume a variety of protein foods from animal sources, including eggs, poultry, seafood, and red meat, as well as a variety of plant-sourced protein foods, including beans, peas, lentils, legumes, nuts, seeds, and soy. Okay, I think that's fine. Again, it's more just the apparent equivalency of the various protein sources that is maybe not quite as evidence-based as it could be. Bullet point number 3, swap deep-fried cooking methods with baked, broiled, roasted, stir-fried, or grilled cooking methods. That's good. Bullet point number 4, consume meat with no or limited added sugars, refined carbohydrates, or starches, or chemical additives. If preferred, flavor with salt, spices, and herbs. Again, I think that's good advice. It's a little interesting because later on they talk about salt as something to really try to minimize. So it's a little bit interesting that they put it here, but again, I think the point is really to avoid all of the artificial junk or processed meats. Okay, point number 5, protein serving goals, 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, adjusting as needed based on your individual caloric requirements. So again, that aligns pretty well with my view on protein for active people. So again, a lot of people aren't active, but I think this is a good directional step. I think the advice to adjust based on individual caloric requirements is good, but again, vague. Are people going to be able to really understand what that means? I don't know. Section number 3, consume dairy. When consuming dairy, include full-fat dairy with no added sugars. Dairy is an excellent source of protein, healthy fats, vitamins, and minerals. Bullet point number 2, dairy serving goals, 3 servings per day as part of a 2,000-calorie dietary pattern, adjusting as needed based on your individual caloric requirements. So this is where I think I'm not quite sure why there's such an emphasis on full-fat dairy. I mean, this makes it sound like full-fat dairy is the way to go. That's the only way to go. Make sure you consume full-fat dairy. I think we've learned that a lot of the demonization of full-fat dairy was a mistake, but I don't think we can say with 100% confidence or even 75% confidence that full-fat dairy is superior to low-fat dairy. So that to me is a little bit maybe overstated. And I think also the idea that you have to have dairy in your diet or this much dairy in your diet in order to have a healthy diet is clearly not evidence-based. There are lots of people, lots of cultures where dairy is not a staple in the diet. They do just fine from a health perspective. So a little bit unsure about the strong recommendations for full-fat dairy. Okay. Gut health is the next section. Your gut contains trillions of bacteria and other microorganisms called the microbiome. A healthy diet supports a well-balanced microbiome and healthy digestion. Highly processed foods can disrupt this balance, while vegetables, fruits, fermented foods, e.g. sauerkraut, kimchi, kefir, and miso, and high-fiber foods support a diverse microbiome, which may be beneficial for health. I think that's good advice. I would have liked to see them emphasize fiber more there and throughout, the dietary guidelines. I think that's maybe not emphasized as much as it could and should be, but that part all seems right to me. Okay, next section, eat vegetables and fruits throughout the day. Bullet point number 1, eat a variety of colorful, nutrient-dense vegetables and fruits. Yes. Bullet point number 2, eat whole vegetables and fruits in their original form. Wash thoroughly prior to eating raw or cooking. Again, yes. Bullet point number 3, frozen, dried, or canned vegetables or fruits with no or very limited added sugars can also be good options. Yes. Emphasis on very limited. Why do we need any added sugars in our canned vegetables or fruits? Get rid of them. Okay. Bullet point number 4. If preferred, flavor with salt, spices, and herbs. Already covered that. Bullet point number 5. 100% fruit or vegetable juice should be consumed in limited portions or diluted with water. Yeah, I agree with that. I think the idea that fruit juice in particular is healthy is really not very well supported. You lose a lot of nutrients, a lot more calorie density, a lot more sugar density there. In general, my approach is I try not to get much, if any, calories each day from liquid, and I don't see a lot of value in fruit and vegetable juices. Just eat the fruits and vegetables. Bullet point number 6, vegetables and fruit serving goals for a 2,000 calorie dietary pattern, adjusting as needed based on your individual caloric requirements. Vegetables, 3 servings per day, fruit, 2 servings per day. I would say that's low for vegetables. You want more than 3 servings per day of vegetables. Next section, incorporate healthy fats. Healthy fats are plentiful in many whole foods, such as meats, poultry, eggs, omega-3 rich seafood, nuts, seeds, full-fat dairy, olives, and avocados. I agree. Bullet point number 2, when cooking with or adding fats to meals, prioritize oils with essential fatty acids, such as olive oil. Other options can include butter or beef tallow. So I think this is fine. I think, one question people might ask is why butter and beef tallow? So I think the answer is they're minimally processed, at least compared to some of the seed oils that are out there. They're more heat stable. So if you're doing very high heat cooking, probably a better option. And they don't have any omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids, which may or may not really be a concern. I think the only comment I would have here is this is really the only place where they mention butter and beef tallow. And so to put those things in the food pyramid at the same level as olive oil and avocados and things like that, I think is questionable choice from a graphical design perspective. But I don't think that's a bad way to frame it in terms of the text. Okay. Bullet point number 3, in general, saturated fat consumption should not exceed 10% of total daily calories. Significantly limiting highly processed foods will help meet this goal. More high-quality research is needed to determine which types of dietary fats best support long-term health. I think that's absolutely right. More research is needed. This is all a moving target, and we're trying to do the best we can based on the data that we have currently. Next section, focus on whole grains. Bullet point number 1, prioritize fiber-rich whole grains. Bullet point number 2, significantly reduce the consumption of highly processed refined carbohydrates, such as white bread, ready-to-eat or packaged breakfast options, flour tortillas, and crackers. I think that's a good idea. Bullet point number 3, whole grain serving goals, 2 to 4 servings per day, adjusting as needed based on your individual caloric requirements. So again, I would say there's no evidence at all that people need 2 to 4 servings of whole grains as part of a healthy diet. If you can substitute those whole grains with vegetables that are high in fiber and nutrients, great. So I'm not convinced that there needs to be as much focus on whole grains as there is here. But I think the idea that people should avoid highly processed refined carbohydrates is good information. Okay. Next section, limit highly processed foods, added sugars, and refined carbohydrates. Bullet point number 1, avoid highly processed, packaged, prepared, ready-to-eat, or other foods that are salty or sweet, such as chips. Damn it, I like chips. Cookies and candy that have added sugars and sodium. Instead, prioritize nutrient-dense foods and home-prepared meals. When dining out, choose nutrient-dense options. Again, I think it's just great advice, right? Avoid the processed packaged garbage. When you eat out, it's harder, but you can still pick meals that are rich in whole foods, seafood, steak, even with vegetables, like a salad. I often will get a salad when I go out to eat. Those are things you can do, even if you're eating out, to maintain a healthy diet consistent with these principles. Okay, bullet point number 2, limit foods and beverages that include artificial flavors, petroleum-based dyes, artificial preservatives, and low-calorie, non-nutritive sweeteners. I don't think this is bad advice to limit those foods. I do take issue with the fact that that's bullet point number 2 in this section. And bullet point number 3 is avoid sugar-sweetened beverages such as sodas, fruit drinks, and energy drinks. I think the idea that those two would even be equivalent is ridiculous. Avoiding the sugar-sweetened drinks is way, way, way more important in my view for health than worrying about artificial dyes and non-nutritive sweeteners. So I know some people won't like that, but I'm pretty confident if we had to make a prediction based on what we know today about what has a bigger effect on people's health, it's the added sugars that are way, way more damaging for most people, for more people, than it is the dyes and the non-nutritive sweeteners. So I think it's a mistake to have those ordered the way they are, or even to imply that they're equivalent in importance. Bullet point number 4. While no amount of added sugars or non-nutritive sweeteners is recommended or considered part of a healthy or nutritious diet, one meal should contain no more than 10 grams of added sugars. So first of all, like why? Why even have that in here? And why 10? Arbitrary. Again, I think just tell people the truth. Just don't eat or drink stuff that has added sugars as much as you can. Bullet point number 5. When selecting snack foods, added sugar limits should follow FDA healthy, quote unquote, healthy claim limits. For example, grain snacks, e.g. crackers, should not exceed 5 grams of added sugar per 3/4 ounce, whole grain equivalent, and dairy snacks, e.g. yogurt, should not exceed 2.5 grams of added sugar per 2/3 cup equivalent. So again, good advice to reduce the added sugar. If you're going to eat foods with added sugar, look for foods that have lower amounts of added sugar. The idea that, this is healthy, that's more of a, I don't know, it's not, but I think it's a pragmatic approach to put a healthy label on things to encourage consumers and food companies towards foods that have less added sugars than the unhealthy versions. And then there's a whole call-out box below this on added sugars. Bullet point number 1 here. To help identify sources of added sugars, look for ingredients that include the word sugar or syrup or end in "ose." I guess that's not bad. Bullet point number 2. Added sugars may appear on ingredient labels under many different names, including high fructose corn syrup, agave syrup, corn syrup, rice syrup, fructose, glucose, dextrose, sucrose, cane sugar, beet sugar, turbinado sugar, maltose, lactose, fruit juice concentrate, honey, and molasses. Examples of non-nutritive sweeteners include aspartame, sucralose, saccharin, xylitol, and acesulfame K. Okay, so a couple things to say here. First of all, it's just kind of funny to read that list of all the different names for added sugars. A real easy policy change would be not to let companies hide added sugars under all sorts of names. Just make them call it out on the label. And then again, I'm just going to point to the fact that they're making an equivalency between non-nutritive, non-caloric sweeteners and added sugars when there just isn't any equivalency. Bullet point number 3. Some food and drinks, such as fruits and plain milk, have naturally occurring sugars. The sugars in these foods are not considered added sugars. That's true, and I think it's good to point out. And if you're thinking about your overall dietary strategy, you do want to be aware of the sugars in the foods that are naturally occurring so you can sort of understand how much sugar is part of your diet. So I think it's fine to have that in here as a bullet point, but you don't want to forget about the sugars that are naturally occurring in your dietary choices. Next page is about alcohol. The header is titled Limit Alcoholic Beverages. Bullet point number 1, consume less alcohol for better overall health. I think that's great advice. Bullet point number 2, people who should completely avoid alcohol include pregnant women, people who are recovering from alcohol use disorder or are unable to control the amount they drink, and people taking medications or with medical conditions that can interact with alcohol. For those with a family history of alcoholism, be mindful of alcohol consumption and associated addictive behaviors, right? So, alcohol's tough. We all know it. We already talked about whether there should be specific numerical limits or not. Again, I don't think there's a right answer. I think reasonable people can disagree on whether numbers are helpful or harmful to have in the guidelines. I don't have a problem with the fact that there are no numbers given here. Also on this page is sodium. It has its own call-out box. Bullet point number 1, sodium and electrolytes are essential for hydration. The general population, ages 14 and above, should consume less than 2,300 milligrams per day of sodium. Highly active individuals may benefit from increased sodium intake to offset sweat losses. For children, the recommendations vary by age. Age 1 to 3, less than 1,200 mg per day. Age 4 to 8, less than 1,500 mg per day. Ages 9 to 13, less than 1,800 mg per day. And then there's an asterisk. Highly processed foods that are high in sodium should be avoided. Again, I think that's fine. I think there's not a ton of evidence that sodium consumption is problematic for most people outside of blood pressure. So certainly at the population level, higher sodium intake is associated with higher blood pressure, and there's all sorts of detrimental consequences of having chronically elevated blood pressure. We're all familiar with that. It's also very individual. So the only nuance, I think these are fine recommendations for the population level. The only individual nuance I would put on this is pay attention to your blood pressure in relation to your sodium intake. You should know what your blood pressure is anyway if you're following a healthy lifestyle. Just pay attention to blood pressure in the context of your sodium intake, and you should be fine when it comes to sodium in that regard. So that's the core of the guidelines. Now we move into special populations and considerations. So the first special population is infancy and early childhood. This is birth to 4 years. There are several bullet points here. I'm going to read through all of them, and then I'll just give you a couple of sort of very general reactions. So bullet point number 1, for about the first 6 months of life, feed your baby only breast milk. When breast milk is not available, feed your baby iron-fortified infant formula. Bullet point number 2, continue breastfeeding as long as mutually desired by mother and child for 2 years or beyond. If feeding or supplementing your baby with infant formula, stop feeding your baby infant formula at 12 months of age and give them whole milk. Bullet point number 3, all breastfed infants, as well as infants who consume less than 32 ounces of infant formula per day, should receive a daily oral vitamin D supplement of 400 IU starting shortly after birth. Consult your healthcare professional about vitamin D supplementation. Bullet point number 4, some infants require iron supplementation. Talk with your healthcare professional about iron supplementation. Bullet point number 5, at about 6 months of age, infants may begin to have solid foods. It is crucial to continue breastfeeding or formula feeding while solids are introduced. Breast milk or infant formula continues to be the main source of nutrition for your infant up to 12 months of age. If your infant is at high risk for peanut allergy due to the presence of severe eczema and/or egg allergy, talk with your healthcare professional about peanut introduction as early as 4 to 6 months. This can be done by mixing a small amount of peanut butter with breast milk or formula, thinning it to a safe consistency, and feeding it by spoon. For infants with mild to moderate eczema, introduce peanut-containing foods at around 6 months of age. Bullet point number 6. Introduce potentially allergenic foods, including nut butters, eggs, shellfish, and wheat, with other complementary foods at about 6 months. Ask your infant's healthcare professional about their risk for food allergies and safe ways to introduce these foods. Bullet point number 7. Infants should receive a diverse range of nutrient-dense foods in appropriate textures while avoiding nutrient-poor and highly processed foods. Bullet point number 8. Examples of nutrient-dense foods to introduce during the complementary feeding period include meat, poultry, and seafood, vegetables and fruits, full-fat yogurt and cheese, whole grains, legumes, and nut or seed-containing foods prepared in a safe, infant-appropriate form. And the last bullet point, but not least, avoid added sugars during infancy and early childhood. Again, a recurrent theme. Again, very, very good advice. So this is all a little bit more specific, actually, than many of the other guidelines. I think it aligns pretty well with my understanding, at least, of current consensus. I think maybe the strong emphasis on full-fat dairy is overstated. Again, there are going to be populations where culturally or because of high incidence of lactose intolerance, this just isn't great advice. So I don't think you have to have full-fat dairy included here for healthy childhood development. There are certainly populations around the world where there isn't an emphasis on full-fat dairy during childhood development, and children develop just fine. So maybe overstated. And I will say in general, I think this is a place where the recommendations, and this is a different conversation, are not recognizing some of the ethnic and cultural diversity that is real around dietary patterns. And I think lactose intolerance is a really interesting example where different ethnic populations have very, very different frequencies of lactose intolerance, and particularly in the context of dairy. I also thought this was interesting. The allergy recommendations here seem to be in line with contemporary thought and data, very different from the allergy recommendations when my children were infants, and certainly from the many, many years ago when I was a young child. So I think this is where the science has changed and the recommendations have changed in the right direction. Next page. Introducing food and infants to toddlers. This is a call-out text box. Bullet point number 1, every child is different. Look for these signs if your child is developmentally ready to begin eating food. Sits up alone or with support. Can control their head and neck. Tries to grasp small objects such as toys or food. Brings objects to their mouth. Opens their mouth when food is offered. Moves food from the front to the back of their tongue to swallow, swallows food instead of pushing it back out on their chin. This makes me remember when my kids were young and going through all of this. Bullet point number 2, parents and caregivers can encourage healthy eating by offering new foods multiple times. It may take 8 to 10 exposures before a young child is willing to try a new food, and by modeling healthy eating behaviors. Next section, middle childhood, 5 to 10 years. This is much shorter. Bullet point number 1. Focus on whole, nutrient-dense foods, such as protein foods, dairy, vegetables, fruits, healthy fats, and whole grains. That just seemed a little weird to me. Protein foods, I'm not sure what that means. I think maybe that was just a proofreading thing, but otherwise, that's fine. Bullet point number 2. Full-fat dairy products are important for children to help meet energy needs and support brain development. Again, that just feels overstated to me. Are they fine? Sure. Is it important? Is it necessary? Again, lots of cultures where that's not a major component of the diet, if at all. Children seem to develop just fine. So not necessary, I would say. Bullet point number 3, avoid caffeinated beverages. I guess that's good advice. It seems intuitive. I'm not sure there's a ton of data to support it, but I guess we don't want our 5 to 10-year-olds bouncing off walls because they're jacked up on coffee. Bullet point number 4, no amount of added sugars is recommended. Just keep nailing that point. That's great. Bullet point number 5, make cooking meals fun and a regular part of the household's routine. That's interesting. Again, not bad advice, not really nutritional, but yeah, I think if you can make cooking meals with high quality ingredients a fun and regular part of a child's experience, that's great. Moving on, adolescence, 11 to 18 years. Bullet point number 1, adolescence is a rapid growth period, that means lots of mTOR, with increased needs for energy, protein, calcium, and iron, especially for girls due to menstruation. Adequate calcium and vitamin D are vital for peak bone mass. True. Bullet point number 2, adolescents should eat nutrient-dense foods such as dairy, leafy greens, and iron-rich animal foods, while significantly limiting sugary drinks and energy drinks and avoiding highly processed foods. When access to nutrient-rich foods is limited, fortified foods or supplements may be needed under medical guidance. I just think it's interesting and kind of funny that they call out dairy and animal foods in this section. Bullet point number 3, Encourage adolescents to become active participants in food shopping and cooking so they learn how to make healthy food choices for life. Again, interesting, but valuable to give that sort of broader guidance. Okay, next section, young adulthood. There's only one bullet point here. Following the dietary guidelines will support optimal health during this period, including reducing risk of the onset or progression of chronic disease and supporting other aspects of health. The brain continues to mature during young adulthood, while the most significant increases in bone density occur during adolescence. Optimizing bone health to achieve peak bone mass and peak bone strength is essential. Additionally, following the dietary guidelines can support reproductive health for both women and men, with special emphasis on healthy fats, iron, and folate for women, and healthy fats and protein for men. I guess we don't have to worry about folate, guys. This seems solid to me. I do like the language. It aligns, as you may be able to tell, very well with the kinds of words and language we use here at Optispan. Next section, pregnant women. Bullet point number 1. Pregnancy increases nutrient needs to support maternal health and fetal growth, with iron, folate, and iodine as top priorities. Bullet point number 2. Pregnant women should consume diverse, nutrient-dense foods, including iron-rich meats, folate-rich greens and legumes, choline-rich eggs, calcium-rich dairy, and low-mercury omega-3 rich seafood. Bullet point number 3. Women should talk to their healthcare professional about taking a daily prenatal vitamin during pregnancy. Next section, lactating women. Bullet point number 1. Lactation increases energy and nutrient needs to support milk production and maternal health. Breastfeeding women should consume a wide variety of nutrient-dense foods, including vitamin B12-rich protein sources such as meats, poultry, eggs, and dairy, omega-3 rich seafood, folate-rich legumes, and vitamin A-rich vegetables. Bullet point number 2. Women should talk to their healthcare professional about whether dietary supplements may be needed while breastfeeding. And then the last section on this page, older adults. Again, only one bullet point here. Some older adults need fewer calories, but still require equal or greater amounts of key nutrients, such as protein, vitamin B12, vitamin D, and calcium. To meet these needs, they should prioritize nutrient-dense foods such as dairy, meats, seafood, eggs, legumes, and whole plant foods, vegetables and fruits, whole grains, nuts, and seeds. When dietary intake or absorption is insufficient, fortified foods or supplements may be needed under medical supervision. So this is just pointing out that as we get older, especially if activity declines, your caloric requirements to maintain body weight are going to go down, and you have to eat an even cleaner diet if you're going to get all of the nutrients that you need to maintain function, muscle mass, bone density, things like that. So again, good advice. We're getting there, guys. This is page 9. Next section, individuals with chronic disease. Bullet point number 1. Following the dietary guidelines can help prevent the onset or slow the rate of progression of chronic disease, especially cardiovascular disease, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. If you have a chronic disease, talk with your healthcare professional to see if you need to adapt the dietary guidelines to meet your specific needs. So good advice again. I do think it's interesting. The language here very much matches the words that I've been saying for many, many years about aging, prevent the onset or slow the rate of progression of chronic disease. That's what happens if we slow biological aging. Bullet point number 2. Individuals with certain chronic diseases may experience improved health outcomes when following a lower carbohydrate diet. Work with your healthcare professional to identify and adopt a diet that is appropriate for you and your health condition. Again, I think that's good advice. I do wonder, what fraction of Americans have a healthcare professional who can and will actually help them with this. But certainly, from an idealistic perspective, this is good advice. And it's nice that it recognizes the individual variation in what's going to be an optimal diet. Last section on this page, vegetarians and vegans. So I think it's good here, given that they've emphasized how important meat is, that they do have a section dedicated to vegetarians and vegans. Okay, bullet point number 1. Consume a variety of whole foods, especially protein-rich foods such as dairy, eggs, beans, peas, lentils, legumes, nuts, seeds, tofu, or tempeh. Bullet point number 2, significantly limit highly processed vegan or vegetarian foods that can include added fats, sugars, and salt. Bullet point number 3, pay careful attention to potential nutrient gaps when consuming a vegetarian or vegan diet. Vegetarian diets often fall short in vitamins D and E, choline, and iron, whereas vegan diets show broader shortfalls in vitamins A, D, E, B6, and B12, riboflavin, niacin, choline, calcium, iron, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, zinc, and protein. Monitor nutrient status periodically, especially for iron, vitamin B12, vitamin D, calcium, and iodine. Bullet point number 4, to avoid nutrient gaps, prioritize targeted supplementation, diversify plant protein sources for amino acid balance, and enhance mineral bioavailability through food preparation techniques. So I think this is pretty good advice. It's really just pointing out that if you are a strict vegetarian or vegan, you're more likely to have nutrient imbalances, nutrient deficiencies. This tells you which nutrients to pay attention to, and you should take steps to make sure that you're getting adequate amounts of all those nutrients. So I think that's good. I'm glad they had it in here. I also thought it was good that they specifically mentioned the need to limit highly processed vegan or vegetarian foods. I think there's a misconception among some people that if it's vegetarian or vegan, it's healthy. That's absolutely not the case. There are many highly processed vegetarian and vegan foods with lots of added sugars that will absolutely put you down the path towards obesity and diabetes. And if you don't believe me, all you got to do is look at India. It's a nation that is largely vegetarian, certainly much more vegetarian than the United States. But in general, it's a fairly unhealthy vegetarian diet, and they have skyrocketing obesity and diabetes rates. So it's important to specifically call that out. Okay, so that is it for the 2025 to 2030 Dietary Guidelines for Americans. You have now mastered this entire document. Again, in general, I think it's pretty good. I think there were some things that could have been done better, but I am very encouraged about the conceptual approach to simply telling people to eat whole foods, minimize processed foods, minimize added sugars, drink less alcohol. Again, I think at the highest level, those are the biggest levers you can pull for diet, and it's good advice for a sort of population level recommendation. So I hope you found that useful. As always, please feel free to leave any questions or comments. We do read them all. And if you're not yet a subscriber, please hit that subscribe button. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the podcast.